Hi, I'm Victoria Thompson, author of Murder on Union Square, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Author's Voice, where we're connecting authors to the world. This is Solved, where we talk to mystery and crime thriller authors. And I am your host, Libby Hellmann. I am the author of 15 compulsively readable thrillers, which I hope you'll check out at some point. Today, we are talking to Victoria Thompson, who has written 20 books in her Gaslight series. She writes historical mysteries. The latest one is, Murder on Union Square. It's published by Berkley. In hardcover, it's $26, and we want to thank Berkley for making the books available for us. If you're watching this on Facebook Live or on our website, please use the comments and ask us a question, or ask Vicki a question. She'll be glad to answer it. Include your first name and where you're from so that we can acknowledge that. Most importantly, please consider ordering a signed book right now. Go to authorsvoice.net to get your copy, and it will be signed by Vicki after our show and sent right out to you. So welcome, Vicki.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's great to see you, too. A lot of you know Vicki and have read her series from the beginning. But for those of you who haven't, I'm going to read just a little bit of background on her. I could talk about her background all day, but we have more things to talk about. Victoria Johnson is the winner of the Career Achievement Award for Mystery from RT Book Reviews in 2011. She's also the best-selling author of the Edgar and Agatha-nominated Gaslight mystery series featuring midwife Sarah Brandt and police detective Frank Malloy. She currently teaches in the master's degree program for writing popular fiction at Seton Hall University, where she earned her MFA. Vicki is a founding member and past president of Novelists, Inc., a national organization of published writers of popular fiction. And I can attest it's an amazing conference. If you're an aspiring writer, you should consider going to it. She's also co-founder and past president of Penn Writers, a statewide writers organization in Pennsylvania. She's served on many boards of directors for both Romance Writers of America and Mystery Writers of America and Sisters in Crime. Victoria lives in a suburb of Chicago with her husband, which is fairly recent, and a very spoiled little dog.
And just want to make one correction. It's
Sure.
Seton Hill University.
Oh, did I say Hall?
You said Hall. But
I'm sorry.
everybody
Seton Hill.
always confuses them, so I just wanted to make sure that
Okay.
was correct.
Thank you. So what years do the Gaslight mysteries take place?
The series starts in 1896, which is the same year that The Alienist was set. And the reason I chose that was because Teddy Roosevelt was a police commissioner then. I thought, oh, what fun. I'll put him in. And he was doing some really interesting things in the police department, trying to reform the very corrupt New York City Police Department. So I thought, well, that would be fun to have him in there, and he would know my heroine, and so that she would have a little entree into the police that way. And the Murder on Union Square, which is the brand new book that just came out in the series number 21, it takes place in 1899. So
20 books in 3 years.
Yes.
Yeah. She's been doing a lot of
She's been
sleuthing.
very busy. Yes.
And Frank too, right?
People have been dropping left and right.
In New York. You know, one of the fascinating things about reading Union Square was that area of New York, 14th Street and Broadway, was that's where the early years of theater in New York was centered. I had no idea.
No, I didn't either, actually. And I was kind of, this book sort of had to be set in the theater because in a previous book, Catherine, my heroine, Sarah, has taken in a little girl, and she wanted to adopt her, but she can't because single women cannot adopt children. So in those days.
That's why she married Frank.
Yes, that was the only reason. So when she and Frank become engaged, one of the things they think is, oh, now we can adopt Catherine. And I got a letter from a fan who explained to me why this would not be possible, because in the book where we discover Catherine's parents, we learn that her father was a very wealthy man, and her mother was his mistress, she was also an actress. And by the end of that book, they are both dead. So I thought, oh, she's free to be adopted now because she's an orphan. Well, as the gentleman who wrote to me is also an attorney, and he explained to me that the law considers a woman's husband to be the father of her children, regardless of any evidence to the contrary. And Catherine's mother happened to be married to another man at the time she had the affair with this wealthy man. So even though everyone agreed her husband could not have been Catherine's father, the law considered him Catherine's father. So they had to get permission from him in order to adopt her. They had to get him to relinquish his parental rights.
Yeah, which you explain in the book, which is really very interesting. Happily, he dies.
Yes, but I guess mystery writers have a very odd sense of humor.
Yes, we do.
But he happened to also be an actor. So of course I had to, because he had to be in this story. I thought when I read this gentleman's letter, I did not think, oh no, this is terrible. I thought, oh, this is wonderful. This would be a great plot for a book. So, and what if he ended up dead, and Frank would be blamed because he was the one who would gain the most from his death. So,
right.
So that's what happens, and that was why it had to be set in acting. And I had sort of just done a some cursory research for the other book about the acting world, but not much, because there wasn't much that took place in that world in that book. But for this one, I had to do really in-depth research, and I wanted to call it Murder on Broadway, but as I discovered, the theater district was just starting to creep down Broadway in these days, and I couldn't call it Murder on Times Square because Times Square didn't exist yet. It was still called Longacre Square, and it wasn't the theater district. Yes, they changed it to Times Square when the Times built their building there. So, so a lot has to happen before there's a Times Square, and it isn't now. So that's why when I researched, I found, Union Square was where the theaters were.
How did you do your research? I know you do impeccable research for all your books, but so you needed to find out about the early theater on Union Square. How did you go about doing that?
Well, I have, in the olden days, I used to spend a lot of time at the library because I was poor and I couldn't afford to buy a lot of books. But now that I'm a little more successful, I have, through the years, bought books. Anytime I need a reference book, I buy it, and I have like 3 huge bookshelves in my office that are all reference books for this time period. So basically, I probably have a lot of what I need right there at my fingertips in these books. But if I'm too lazy to turn around and pull a book off the shelf, I just Google something. And I found an old book written during this time period about the theater.
Really?
And yes, it was like a history, but it was written like in the early 1900s. So there was a lot of information that I got from there.
Is that where your character, Mrs. Hawks, came from? Was that her name?
Mrs. Hawks.
What's her name's? What's the husband? The husband and wife, the older woman, the older actress that liked the younger.
Oh, yes.
Was I wrong?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes, that's where I read about Mrs. Fisk, who was the actress I based her on. And I also found out about the syndicate, which worked really nicely into the plot, that back in the olden days, every theater operated independently, and they all booked their shows and actors independently, which was a mess, as you can imagine, trying to book shows all the way across the country for a tour. And they would get there and the theater would be closed or had gone out of business, or there was another play already there, or they'd do the play and not get paid and be stranded. It was a nightmare for the actors.
So the syndicate it wasn't really a union, it was more like a cartel, right?
It was like a monopoly, essentially. They all these men who owned large numbers of theaters across the country got together, and they organized a monopoly, and then they would schedule all the shows, which worked out actually very well for the actors because they never got stranded. They always would arrive and have a theater to perform in, and And they always got paid. So it was good for them in a way, but they had no creative freedom. They couldn't, they did what they were told, essentially.
Right, and it sounds like they weren't averse to heavy persuasion.
No. Well, in my version.
The one, oh, okay.
Yeah, but it was true. They pretty much froze you out if you didn't go along with what they wanted. They would freeze you out, and that's what Mrs. Fisk did. She refused to cooperate.
In reality.
In reality, and this she was a real actress, and she was one of the very, very few who didn't join the syndicate. And she performed until the day she died, but she was performing in skating rinks and churches, and she was very often couldn't even find a place to perform, and it cost her hundreds of thousands of dollars in income, and she died penniless as a result of it. So that's where I got the idea for Mrs. Hawks. I'm sorry, I forgot her name.
No, after 20 books, you're allowed. You're allowed to forget a name or two. I do it all the time. If you're watching now and you'd like to write in a question, just go right ahead and write it in underneath in the comments section of Facebook, and tell us your first name and where you are, and we will get the question asked. I wanted to ask, one thing that struck me was the dialogue, and it was very cleverly done because it was colloquial, it was American, and yet it was suitable for the time period. And I wanted to ask you, how do you structure that dialogue so that it was all those things?
Oh my goodness, dialogue's probably the hardest thing to write, and especially when you're writing historically. You have to make a fine line, because sometimes if you wrote something that's historically accurate, it sounds actually too modern. Right. So it's a fine line. I have books that have lists of slang phrases for different time periods. So so I'm careful about that. And if I say something that's maybe a little weird, I always Google it to make sure that it was in common usage at that time and not something that was thought up in the 40s or something like that. So so I'm very careful about historical accuracy in slang and phrases like that. But
even in the diction, even in the way they spoke, it didn't sound stilted. But I knew that you were.
Yes,
I knew you were doing something.
And probably people did speak in a very stilted way compared to the way we speak today. So it's not completely accurate. But I make them sound a little more formal than we do today, because that's what people expect, and it makes them sound more historical.
It worked for me. We do have a question from Matt in Burbank. Thanks, Matt. I love the idea of Teddy Roosevelt playing a part in your books. What rules do you apply to writing fictional versions of historical character figures?
Thank you for asking that. That's I really have a hang-up about people who use historical characters doing things that they would not, or certainly did not do, and probably would not have done. And of course, Frank and Sarah did not exist, so everything they did didn't really happen. But Teddy Roosevelt was the police commissioner. He was an authority. He was trying to reform. So, and he was, I'm sure, encouraging them to solve crimes and things like that. So. That's what I have him doing in my book, in my books, that when I use him. Now, I never expected the series to go on as long as it has. A 21-book series is just unheard of. So, so when I started it, I never really thought about what was going to happen to poor Teddy. But Teddy is now the time has passed when he was police commissioner. He has gone now to Washington, D.C. to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He has then gone on to fight in the Spanish-American War. And now he's the governor of New York. And very soon he's going to be nominated vice president. And then after that, he'll become president. So if the series goes on a few more books, we'll have him.
You'll have to have him back.
Yes, I will definitely have to have him back.
Maybe they'll go to the White House for some sort of dinner.
I'm sure they'll have to.
Yeah. Speaking of that, gaslight, I understand, is a term for the gaslights around Union Square.
Right.
Do you ever get any cracks about gaslighting?
Yeah, people often do ask me if anybody gets gaslighted in my books, and no, not really.
Let's talk about your characters a little bit. I know that your fans probably know more about Malloy and Sarah and Maeve and Gino than I do, but have they always been sort of your go-to characters, or do they have their own separate arcs?
They all do have their own separate arcs. Maeve and Gino were not in the books in the beginning. It was Frank and Sarah all by themselves. And in one of the books, Sarah becomes involved in a settlement house, and where they take in young girls to help them avoid a life of prostitution. And Sarah gets involved with them as a volunteer, and someone leaves this foundling child on their doorstep. She's much too young for the place, and that's Catherine. And so Sarah ends up taking her in, but she can't earn a living and take care of a child, so she gets one of the older girls from the mission to come and live with her, and that's Maeve. And so Maeve is her nanny, essentially, to take care of the child. And when I first started writing mysteries, I asked a good friend of mine, Jill Churchill, who had a very successful mystery series back then, and what she wished she had known. And one of the things she said, she wished she had known how difficult it was when your heroine has a young child, because she'd given her heroine 3 children. 2 were teenagers, and they were fine, but the other one was like in 3rd grade, and he had to be babysat all the time. So whenever her heroine needed to do something, she had to send the boy over to play with a neighbor or get grandmother to watch him, or she was always worried about what to do with this kid. She said, "Don't have any kids that need to be babysat."
So of course now you have 2.
So then when I realized she had to take in a child, that I just gave her a live-in nanny that takes care of that. So
that's great.
But now she's in school, and Maeve is helping with. So Maeve sort of transitioned from nanny to assistant detective. And Frank needed help one time in a case, and Gino was a young recruit at that time, and they had just started taking Italians onto the police force, because it was purely Irish before then. And so he sort of took Gino under his wing, and so Gino came along and became these people just sort of horned in of their own volition. Yeah. I never planned that they'd be.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah, and Frank used to be a cop, but now he's a PI.
Cop. Right, yes. He came into some money, and he could no longer be a police officer. There was just too much jealousy there, so people wouldn't work with him, and he just had to leave the police department. So now he's a private investigator, and because he's wealthy, he can take on cases that may not necessarily even pay. He can just do whatever he wants. So that's made it fun. I sort of opened up the possibility of cases for him, too.
Absolutely. Why historical novels?
I have tried to write contemporaries. I really did. I tried to write contemporary romances. I tried to write contemporary thrillers. In fact, when my historical romance publisher told me they weren't going to buy any more books from me, I was already writing some thrillers, and I kept sending proposal after proposal to my agent, and she kept sending them out, and I kept getting these wonderful rejection letters. "We love this book, but we're not going to publish it." And then when this opportunity came up to write the historical series for Berkeley, by that point I had pretty much realized that my natural voice is historical. I'm a little old-fashioned, I'm a little stilted. I was raised by parents that grew up during the Depression, and they were, it was a much different time when I grew up, and so the historical, just everything about the historical period appealed to me, and it seemed to be my natural voice. So I've kind of given up trying to write a contemporary. Just do what you do best, and that's what.
Did you major in history?
No, I majored in English education. Okay. I was going to be an English teacher, so that's how I ended up teaching writing. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Interesting.
And I never really was all that fond of history, because the way they teach history in schools, it's kind of boring. Yeah. And I always tell people, if you read my books, I promise you never have to memorize a single date. There will be no tests. And what historical fiction is pretty much the part that makes you say, "Wow, I didn't know that. That is really cool." And the thing that I love most about this time period is that the issues that people were concerned about then are the same issues people are concerned about now. The technology is different, but human nature is still the same. And the same social issues are, it's just immigration, finding Mr. Right,
corruption
in government.
Yep.
I mean, just
doesn't change, does it?
Women in the workplace, trying to be able to make a living on their own without a man to take care of them. I mean, those things are still issues today.
Yeah, they sure are. Now I'm going to make you choose. Who's your favorite character?
My favorite character?
Who do you, I mean, I know there's always a character that probably comes on the page and writes himself or herself. Do you have one of those?
Yes. Sarah's mother. When the series starts, Sarah's the daughter of an old Knickerbocker family, so one of the very socially elite families and wealthy families in New York City, and she has rebelled against her family for reasons that come out in the book, and has not spoken to her parents in years. I wanted to make her able to move in all levels of society, because that would make it a lot easier to solve mysteries if she could go to Mrs. Astor's house as well as to the tenements. So she can move in any segment of society because of who she is. But so I had her reconcile with her parents very early on in the series, never dreaming that they would become very important. But I think she needed their help to do something, and so she reconciled with them. And her mother popped up in one of the books and started helping her solve the mystery. And she turned out to not only be really interesting, but to be hilarious. And she's so funny. And her father was this really prim and proper, stick-in-the-mud guy. Well, he turned out to be pretty funny, too. So the two of them have just been a revelation to me. I never planned them. They just sort of forced their way into the books.
Right. Did you start the series writing from different points of view, or did that come?
Just Frank and Sarah in the beginning, and it became, and then in the Murder on Bank Street, in which they solved Sarah's husband's murder, which had taken place 3 years before the series starts. Sarah couldn't investigate it because the killer would know who she was. So I had to bring Maeve in to work, and I had to give her a point of view. And then once I did that, the floodgates were open.
Yeah. Once you do that, yeah, exactly. Do you have a favorite novel of the Gaslight series? I know the latest baby is always your favorite.
So yeah, the one I just finished writing is my favorite.
Okay, but that's a different series, right?
Well, I mean, whatever book I have just finished writing is my favorite.
But seriously, going
back, I think I'd have to say Murder in Chelsea, because that's the book in which they get engaged.
Okay.
And that is like book 15 in the series, and fans were getting so annoyed with me.
Like, get it on.
Because I never thought it would go on that long, or I would have planned better. And it had gotten to the point where they had to get married. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And so I had to figure out a way. It was really hard, but I finally did. And that happened in Murder in Chelsea. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk just for a minute. You have a new series coming out.
Yes.
The second book is coming out in November.
Second book is
Counterfeit Lady.
The Counterfeit Lady series.
Tell me about
it's not really a mystery. It's more a caper. The heroine is a con artist who she's running away from a con gone bad in Washington, D.C., and she joins the suffragettes who are demonstrating outside the White House because she knows they've been getting arrested, and she thinks, I will get arrested with them, get away from these guys who are chasing me, and then they would let them go the next day, so she would just sneak away and be safe. Well, in this particular time, this was November of 1917, and that year the suffragettes had demonstrated outside the White House every single day. By November, the president was really annoyed, and he said he was going to teach them a lesson, so he threw them in the workhouse for 3 months. And that's what their sentence was. And so she ends up going to this workhouse with these women and having no interest whatsoever in women's rights or anything like that. She goes in, she comes out, she's a convert.
She's a flaming radical,
She
right?
is. And is ready to use her powers. she has many talents, and she realizes they will translate beautifully into making her way in high society and in helping women's rights.
Sounds great.
So she's using her skills to get justice for people who would not normally be able to get justice.
When all the cons she can pull.
Yes.
What fun. What fun. What's it called? What's the
The
second
first
one?
book is called City of Lies, and the second book is City of Secrets, and it's out in November.
Great. Okay, now I know you switched from romance to mystery. And if you want to talk about why you did, that's fine. But my real question is, what did you learn, or what were the differences in craft between the two genres that you needed to adhere to or explore?
Well, interestingly enough, when I was writing historical romances, they had to be 500 pages long. Some of them had to be 600 pages long. And you need a lot of plot. You can only write so many love scenes. You have to have some plot in there. So I had started putting mystery subplots in my historical romances. And my agent, who's my agent now, was my editor then, and for a while. And she knew I had been doing this, which is why she was encouraging me to write a mystery. So I had already done mysteries and sort of practiced a few times to get it right. And so the craft I had already been working on. What I had to be careful with, they told me when I started the mysteries, they said, mystery writers don't like romance in their mysteries. Everyone told me this. So be very careful, don't put a lot of romance in there. And I thought, that can't be true. What they don't want a lot of sex, they don't want a lot of mushy stuff, but they do want relationships. And I always tell my students that they come for the mystery, but they come back for the characters. And I thought I wanted people to be invested in Frank and Sarah. And I put all these obstacles between them. They couldn't possibly ever get together. It would be like Ivanka Trump married the Muslim gardener. It would just never happen. These two people were so far apart socially. And
Stranger things.
But it was obvious to anyone that read the book that they had to get together, so that they were destined for each other. And I started getting the fan letters to the first book, and they all said, "Oh, I love the plot. I couldn't guess who the killer was. Blah 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 blah. When are Frank and Sarah getting together?" Every fan letter ended with that sentence. So I thought, okay, so much for mystery readers not wanting romance in their books. They do love relationships.
Yeah, I actually put a little bit of relationship stuff in every single one of mine.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
it's vital because you want them to come. You want the reader to be invested in your detective.
What's the hardest part of writing for you?
The hardest part? Figuring out what happens next. I actually really enjoy writing. Sometimes I get stuck, and I don't usually admit this in mixed company, but I'm a one draft writer, so I don't do a lot of revisions. So if I get stuck, I just have to stop until I figure it out, because I can't write past something if it's not right. So it sometimes I do get stuck. So that's hard, but
I get stuck a lot, and I do exactly. I have to stop because I don't want it to go off. I don't want to go off into a corner or write myself into a hole.
And I certainly don't want to write something I'm going to have to throw out.
Right.
Jeez, I'm so
Yeah,
lazy.
I
can't even stand the thought of it.
562 words.
Exactly, it's wasted. What was I thinking?
Do you outline, or do you write basically with what
When I wrote romances, I was an outliner, man. I had the entire book completely plotted and composed. All I was doing was typing it up so other people could read it. And in the beginning, I sort of did that too, but now I've developed kind of a compromise between, we call it pantsing, which is writing by the seat of your pants, or plotter.
I hate that expression.
I know, it's not a good expression.
I kind of refuse to use it.
But it does explain what it is. But so I'm sort of in the middle. I come up with the victim and his backstory, and then I come up with 5 suspects and give them all a motive for killing him, an opportunity, and a secret that makes them look guilty. It may have something to do with the murder, it may not. But so if I and with those 5 suspects, with that little baggage, that's pretty much all you need to fill out the book. So
excellent. Right.
Yeah.
Well, you just did a mystery writing class in 30 seconds.
I did.
Thank you. How have the changes in the business changed the way you write or publish, or have they?
Well, knock on wood, it hasn't changed me too much because I'm still completely traditionally published. All my new books are still being traditionally published, and I know that could end tomorrow, but I've been very, very fortunate. I've published my first book in 1985. Wow. And there's only been 1 year since then I didn't have at least one new book out. So I have been very, very lucky. All my historical romances were out of print, and I got the rights back to all of them, and I have indie published them. Haven't really done much. I just sort of put them up there and haven't spent a lot of energy promoting them or anything. They're just out there if somebody wants them. So
hint,
it hasn't.
Hint, guys.
Yes, right.
Go to Amazon.
If you like historical romance, these are the old-fashioned kind. Long and sexy.
Do you think you'd be published today in today's business climate had you not started 30 years ago?
That's a very good question, and I don't know. I don't know. I know that publishers are still, finding new authors and publishing new authors, but not nearly in the numbers that they used to. And I know that many of my friends who had a long career in traditional publishing and were dropped for one reason or another lost their publisher, and many publishers have gone out of business or been acquired by bigger publishers. There just aren't as many slots available, so they have continued to publish and make a good living, because they had a fan base and all that. So that has been extremely fortunate for a lot of writers, but I don't know. It's a hard world out there.
Tell me about it. All right, I think we are coming up on the end of our discussion and conversation with Victoria. We've been talking about Murder on Union Square, which is published by Berkley. It's in hardcover for $26. Thanks again, Berkley. And just for a second, I'd like to tell you what's coming up on Author's Voice. Lit with Love, author Sarah McLean will join Sonali in a live question and answer session on our Facebook page, that's Author's Voice, with our pre-recorded interview next Thursday at 2 p.m. So check our website for details. You can ask a question, you can order a signed copy, and we really hope that you do just by going to authorsvoice.net. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can still order a signed copy after the broadcast. Go ahead and just go to the link underneath the file. Thanks again for being with us. This was really delightful. This was a really fun conversation. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you again.